Well, here's to hoping that this will actually work again, but we are at an exciting place in our study of the Gospel of Mark because we're leading up to Calvary, and so we're getting to the place now where Jesus is going through the trial with Pilate, and where he's going to be beaten and he's going to be flogged. And so, this week and next week really challenge us with the idea of God's love for us and the fact that he was willing to endure so much for us. And I think it's important for us as we consider this with our teens to be ready to talk about the impact it has in our life. One of my favorite moments as a young man growing up in high school was sitting next to my dad and watching how when people would talk about Christ and the passion of the Christ, how much it moved him because he completely understood the pain that Christ went through and how it was for him and he wasn't worthy. A lot of times with our kids growing up in church, having been in church all the time, they've heard these stories over and over again, and so the significance of it gets lost on them, and they don't fully understand what Christ went through and how it was for them specifically. And so I hope that we can help tie that to them. If you have your Bible, turn to Mark 15. We'll be talking from the book of Mark. Hey, I just want to say thank you so much for your hard work with our teens. If you have gotten to a place where maybe things are just coasting, let me encourage you to dig in. I do want to say I would encourage any small group leaders to please make sure that you actually go be with your small group during lesson time and not be spending time hanging out in other areas or doing other things, but actually be a part of your group. This delivers a very loud message to the kids that are in your group, and they need you to be in there with them. All right, Mark 15, I'm going to break it into sections. We're going to eventually read verses 1 through 20, but I'm going to talk through 3 different sections. The first section is found in verses 1 through 5, where Jesus is accused and silently waits. I'll read verses 1 through 5. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. Let's just walk through this quickly. I realize the passage is pretty open and shut for us, but I just kind of want to go through it a little bit. Pilate here is asking Jesus one question. There's one accusation that seems to stick with Jesus, and that is that Jesus claims to be the king of the Jews. Pilate asked Jesus, "Do you claim to be the king of the Jews?" That statement right there had some political overtones for the Roman Empire and for Pilate specifically. For Jesus to declare to be the Jews' king who was under submission to the Roman Empire was quite a thing, because if you have a king, an uprising could come quickly. And so that statement alone of Jesus acknowledging it, Jesus responds and says, "You have said it." So even though Pilate didn't recognize that, he had rightly just proclaimed who Jesus was. Jesus declaring to be the king of the Jews. And the chief priests began to make all kinds of accusations against Jesus. They just start throwing accusations after him, and Jesus stands there in complete silence. And we're told from this text that Pilate is simply amazed that Jesus will not respond to all these accusations. And I just want you to think about this for a second. There's a whole lot of stuff that Jesus could have said in that moment. He could have pointed out all of the ways that they were wrong. I mean, like he did with the woman caught in adultery. Jesus could have easily gone into a big, long list of all the ways that they had failed in their own life. He could have said the most amazing things to reveal that he is God and to confound the priests. He could have abandoned his task and ascended to heaven. Or he could have just stood there silently, accused, because he was willing to take the suffering so that he could restore his creation. Now let's move on to verses 6 through 14, and let's just realize who the crowd chose over Jesus. Now at the feast, he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas had been in prison with the insurrections who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the crowd went up and began asking him as he had been accustomed to do for them. And Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with him who you call the king of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him." But Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." At the Passover, it had become a tradition that one prisoner was going to be pardoned. They would be released. They would be turned loose at that time. And so Pilate decided that he would pick out Barabbas to put up next to Jesus. He thought, surely Jesus has done nothing so terrible that anybody would want him to die over Barabbas. They thought for sure they would release Jesus. But Barabbas was a freedom fighter, and as a result of fighting for this freedom, he had also been a murderer. Pilate knew he had no grounds to punish Jesus, and the crowd was worked up, though, and demanded that they have Barabbas. The crowd demands that Jesus be the one who is crucified. I want you to think about this. Jesus did not deserve this death, yet Jesus did not resist this death. Pilate washes his hands of this evil, but the crowd demands that Jesus be crucified. This is an amazing thing to think about. While Pilate, Barabbas, the crowd, the priest had no idea what was going on, they were a part of God's plan of redemption. Sinclair Ferguson said it this way: without knowing it, the religious leaders and Pilate and Barabbas were all part of the tapestry of grace which God was weaving for sinners. Their actions spoke louder than their words, louder than the cries of the crowds for Jesus' blood. Jesus was not dying for his own crimes, but for the crimes of others, not for his own sins, but for the sins of others. He did not die for himself. He died for us. It's an incredible thing to think about, that Jesus' substitution into where we deserve to be, into where Pilate deserved to be, into where Barabbas deserved to be, into where everyone in that crowd and the priest deserved to be. Jesus did that because of his love and his desire to restore us. Verses 15 through 20 talks about the pain that Jesus suffered. Verse 15, wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers took him away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. And they dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating his head with a reed, and spitting on him, and kneeling and bowing before him. And after they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him, and put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. I want you to think of the pain that Jesus endured. They beat him with a cat of nine's tail. In fact, so much so that he was unrecognizable as a man. They wrapped him in cloth, and in this purple cloth, and put it on him to let it dry to his wounds. They put a crown of thorns on his head, and they beat it into his skull. They mocked him. They ripped that robe back off of him, and they put another robe on him and forced him to go away to be crucified. And yet, with every act of hatred to God, they simply intensified his act of love for us. Jesus endured what we deserve. Jesus took our place. Jesus was willing to suffer our shame. I want you to come prepared to discuss with your group 3 questions, and want you to make sure that you've put some time into this and think about it. Question 1. What would have been some of the arguments that Jesus could have used to avoid this suffering? Question 2. What is substitutionary atonement? Explain it. So help them to explain what substitutionary atonement is. And 3. What value is there in remembering the horrible suffering that Jesus endured for you? I hope that you have a great week, and I hope to see you on Sunday. I'll be at Faith West, so Faith East, I hope that things go well for you, and I look forward to hearing how God worked this Sunday. We'll see you later.